We start the topic today with the question about how to deal with the violations and conflict within a group that can create more trust-based environment instead of fear-based environment. Because when in Vietnam, we share about the nonviolent communication, and so a lot of questions from people comes about the violence can happen in many contexts, like in the school or university, when the student can have some disruption behavior, like fighting, bullying, or they have some academic dishonesty, or they use some drug or alcohol. Or it also can happen in the workplace when there's a lot of problem, like when I experience or I see a sexual harassment or discrimination. So how I can deal with it, even a leader or even like I am a staff in the group. And so the very popular way of dealing with the conflict or the violation is like using the punishment. And then it also creates more and more other problems, and the dissatisfaction of a lot of people, individual, and later it's about the unhealthy culture. And then we really want to invite Duc with that he had a lot of experience with restorative practice, and also he's one of our 4 trainers for international intensive training in Vietnam for this Q&A. So I know that it's really a huge topic, but so today is also a chance. I really want to invite a very interactive manner, and maybe it will start a little bit with Duc sharing about restorative justice and practice and some of his experience. And then it will be an open space for everyone can ask a question and hear some story and experience from Duc. So now I think I feel really ready and don't let everyone need to wait anymore. So I really want to invite Duc. Maybe you can share a little bit about yourself and the practice of restorative justice. Maybe I pass to Duc.
All right. Thank you, Trang, and thank you all to the Vietnam IIT team for all that you're doing to make today happen and so much more that we're going to share about today. So just want to say thank you. And thank you to all of you for being willing to share your precious time this evening or afternoon, depending on where you live in the world. And sorry, I was just saving my language there. It popped up on my screen. So today we're going to look at, restoring collective trust is sort of the overarching theme. And in particular, we're going to look a little bit at restorative practices. And so I want to jump right in by getting some response or feedback from all of you. So I want to ask a question. How many of you have ever had a disagreement, a misunderstanding, or been in a conflict? Please give us a thumbs up if that's ever happened to you in your life. I'm seeing a few thumbs up. Oh, there's a few more. Okay. Yeah. Oh my goodness. Trang, what have you gotten me into? All these people, no conflict. Ah! So, what does that tell us about disagreements, misunderstandings, conflict? Does it tell us that there's something wrong with all of us? Because we've all had a disagreement, we've all had a conflict? I choose not to believe that there's something wrong with me because I have conflicts, but rather to see that it's actually natural. That because we each see the world in a different way, sometimes that way of seeing is going to bump up with other people, bump against other people. And we're going to have a different opinion, a different way of seeing what happened, or a different way of seeing, or thinking about what's best, what's the best way forward here. So it's natural, it's going to happen. So conflict and misunderstandings, disagreements, they're not the problem from a nonviolent communication perspective. Rather, they're just a way of letting us know, oh, that we're seeing the world different, or we're needing to kind of maybe understand each other because we're coming from a different place than, you're coming from a different place than I'm coming from. So, and restorative practices are based on that awareness. They're based on the idea that, wow, if we have conflict, nothing's wrong, not one of us is bad and the other one is good, not one of us is wrong and one of us is right, but rather, can we understand each other? That's the focus. Now, for most of you, I'm guessing, maybe all of you, certainly for me, I grew up in a system that looked at conflict from a punitive perspective. And what do I mean by that, punitive? It means, again, that it's based on the idea that if we have a conflict, well, obviously one of us is right and one of us is wrong, or one of us is good and one of us is bad, or one of us act appropriately and the other one act inappropriately. So it, and then so it sets us on to thinking about, can we determine who's right and who's wrong? And then if, goodness gracious, if I'm the wrong one, well, what do I get for being wrong? What do I deserve for being wrong? Well, I deserve to be admonished or punished or in some way shamed or, shown the right way to correct myself. And, that is an attempt to try to deal with conflict and try to find a way forward. And restorative practices and certainly nonviolent communication comes from a different place. It comes from that place of wanting to understand. It's recognizing that, oh, you see the world different than I see the world. Okay. Well, instead of saying you're wrong and I'm right, can we say, well, can you understand me? And can I try to understand you? So restorative practices are based on some simple but very important principles. One of them is that it recognizes that we're all interconnected, that we live in a web of relationships. And so if conflict happens, that's a disturbance in the relationship. And so we want to look at that relationship because it's important, because that's how we live, is through that web of relationships. So, and in seeing that, it also recognizes that we must then be interdependent. Because in a web, if you touch any part of the web, the whole web responds or reacts, right? And so if we are in a web of relationships, then, if I get disturbed in my relationships, that's going to ripple out to those around me. So, for example, if I had a fight with my sister, then other members of my family would be impacted by that, you know, both directly other brothers and sisters, parents, but what also about, wives, sisters, maybe cousins, maybe others, neighbors who are very close to our family. They will be impacted by that conflict. And restorative practices recognizes that they will be impacted. And it also recognizes that they have influence on my sister and I, on the way we relate to each other, and on the way we handle the conflict. So, another key principle of restorative practices is community. It recognizes that if we're going to work with this conflict or this disagreement, it can be really helpful to involve other people who are directly and indirectly impacted by what's happening, for example, between my sister and I. You know, so if we're going to truly change what's happening and understand and learn from this conflict, then we need to involve maybe, other brothers, other sisters, parents, possibly neighbors, depending on who's involved. So this is some of the things that restorative practices look at instead of trying to figure out who's right and who's wrong. Can we understand each other so that we have a more full picture of what's happening here, why we're in conflict? It's kind of like, as I said at the beginning, we each have a different way of seeing the world. So, of course, we're going to have conflict at times. Similarly, because we each see the world differently, it's like we each hold a piece of a very big puzzle, and the whole puzzle is the conflict. Now, I'm looking at my piece of the puzzle, and I think this is the reasons why we're having conflict, and this is the solution. But you're also looking at your piece of the puzzle, and it's a different piece than mine. And so you're thinking, oh, this is the way, this is the problem here, and here's how we solve it. And what restorative practices does is it says, you all have an important piece of the puzzle. And so let's get those puzzles down, those puzzle pieces down in front of us on the table so we can see the whole puzzle together. And if we do that, then we'll be much more successful at solving this problem that the conflict has brought to our awareness. So that's one of the things I love about restorative practices and involving the wider community is it brings in many more pieces so that we can see what the conflict is about truly in a much broader and deeper way. I can understand the different people's perspectives and they can understand mine. And when that happens, then it's much easier for us to work together to solve whatever the conflict, the challenges or problems the conflict is raising up. So this way of working, these restorative practices, is something that I've been doing now for 15, 18 years. And I work a lot with groups of people or communities in conflict. Sometimes they're in active conflict where the conflict is live, it's happening now. And sometimes that's a very violent conflict where people have actually been killed in this conflict. And I also work in conflict areas where the conflict is over and they're in a place now where they're trying to reconcile. The conflict's happened, there's been violence, there's been killing, and now we're trying to live again, together again. And how do we do that? And again, this restorative practices can be very helpful for that, so that we can understand where each other is now. We can hear the pain of each other from the conflict that's happened. And then together we can look at how do we live together now? How do we move forward from here? So, um, a recent example I can share where I did some work using restorative practices so you have a more live example, and then we can open up for questions and things. In November, I was recently in Somalia, and I was working there with state government officials, non-government workers, and community members, people who had been displaced because of ongoing conflict in the region. And they were in conflict around the reporting of sexual and gender-based violence cases. And the conflict had gotten to a place where the government officials, the police, had arrested several of the non-government organization workers because of the way they were reporting, thinking they were reporting false cases to get funding. So we brought these three groups together, the government workers, the non-government workers, were like for-profit work, who worked in the area of sexual and gender-based violence, and then the community members who were impacted by this. And we had a dialogue. And at first, the government was saying, well, these are the rules and you need to follow the rules. And if you don't follow the rules, then you'll suffer the consequences. And the NGO workers were saying, well, the restrictions that you've put on us has made it very difficult for us to do our work safely. Because for the community members, when it's sexual and gender-based violence, there's a lot of shame involved. And so it's very hard for them to come forward. And they don't want the police and whole community to know, what's happening in their families or what's happened to their wives or daughters. And so they wanted to keep it private. And so initially the government was just like, this is the way it is, deal with it, too bad. But as they were heard and listened to, and as the NGO workers were able to understand, the good reasons why they were saying that they were wanting to protect people. And it was their job, their duty to care for these communities and protect them. And if rapes or things like that were happening in the community, they needed to be involved. And so the NGO workers heard that. And because the government workers had been received in this way and understood, they became more open to then listen to the non-government workers and the community members. And so they heard from the non-government workers how challenging it is to do their work if they have to follow these strict guidelines that the government put down, because then none of the community members will talk with them. No one will report it, and they'll just try to deal with the cases themselves through violence in the communities, getting retribution. And they heard that from the communities as well, that they really need the support of the non-government workers to be able to handle these cases in a safe way, but constructive way. And so as the government workers heard this, it started to open them to new possibilities. And they started to shift from, this is the law, too bad, you have to follow it. And they started to open to a possibility to see, wow, we need these non-government workers because they do things in the communities that we can't do. We don't have the capacity to do that. So if we truly want to support the community, then we need to make sure they can do their jobs as best as possible. And we've certainly heard from the community how much they need these workers' help and support. And so through understanding each other, then the government workers were willing, even though they had all the power, they could have just at the end of the 3 days of dialogue, they could have said, too bad, these are the rules, you need to follow them, and if you don't, you don't. But because they heard and received what these other two groups said, they shifted. They were willing to then see if there was ways they could still take care of what they needed, the information they needed to get it. But could they get it in different ways, and maybe not for all the cases, so that the government workers could continue to do their jobs effectively? So that's one example of where these restorative practices, instead of saying, well, you're wrong and you're right, can we come together, understand each other, and then together can we find a way forward that can help all of us, can care for all of us? So I know I've shared a lot. So I want to open it up. I'm guessing that might have stimulated some questions or some wanting clarity. So I'll open it up for questions to see if anyone wants to speak a question or put in the chat. And then I will definitely need translation support. Does anyone have anything they want me to clarify or questions they have to ask?
May, may I ask something?
Okay.
I feel a bit embarrassed with being the first to ask a question in front of so many people. Uh, um, Thank you for sharing what you've shared. You talk about restorative justice, and I wonder what are the steps to build a restorative roadmap? And maybe that's a really wide question, but I mean, I am an NVC certified trainer, and I use NVC a lot with companies, and I also coach teams. And sometimes there is a lot of tension between management and the team. So
Mm,
NVC definitely helps. So does coaching. But I was really interested in knowing a bit more on what the restorative justice can, and I don't know if justice is the right word, could add to the process. And yeah.
great. Thank you, Annabelle. Yeah, so in restorative justice, because it's some of the values or principles that we talked about, like community and interdependence, you know, ideally, if what we would want to do is to come together to look at and say, wow, we have conflict. So how do we want to deal with it? Or even if we don't have conflict now, chances are we're going to have conflict. So how do we want to work with conflict? What are our values? What are our principles that are important to us in how we are going to deal with conflict? Because I don't know about you, even though I've had years and years of training and practice dealing with conflict. I still have moments when, in the heat of the conflict, I forget my values and I act and I behave in ways that I later regret. And so I want to set up a way of working with conflict, structures and processes that help me to live my values when it's most difficult, like when I'm in conflict, when I have a lot of emotion going on inside of me. And so one of the things that restorative practices invites us to do is to think about that and to see if together we can plan how can we support each other by creating a structure and a process that helps us when it's most difficult, you know? And so it's talking about that and saying, well, what's important to us when we have a conflict? Well, I want everyone to be respected when they speak. Okay, great. How do we do that? Well, I want make sure that, you hear my voice because sometimes no one hears me or cares about me. Okay, great. How do we do that? And so it's like taking all of those different things that are important to you. How do I want to, what's important when I'm in a conflict? And then how do we actually turn that into a process? So, for example, one of the agreements we can have, like, okay, I want to have my voice heard. Okay, great. Well, I'm guessing so does everybody else in this conflict. Okay, how can we create a process that ensures that everyone gets a chance to speak if they want to speak? So it's not just the boss, or it's not just the head of the school, or it's not just the head of the household who gets a chance to speak and say what's going on here. How about we all get a chance to speak? The children get a chance to speak, or, the lower employees get a chance to speak about what this conflict is like for them and what's important to them. So that's one of the things that can be super helpful is to do that ideally, ahead of time but whenever it happens, to sit down together and really think about so that way we have an agreement. Next time conflict happens, or even with this conflict, how can we do it in a way that we've all agreed to that we'd like to try? Because if we don't, in my experience, if we don't set that up ahead of time, then each of us is going to fall back into whatever we've always done. And often, certainly for me, I learned ways of being in conflict that weren't very helpful. Like one of my favorite things was shut up and don't say a word and hope it goes away. It doesn't help resolve the conflict. So how can we support each other so that we can move beyond those unhelpful ways of dealing with conflict to something that could really work for all of us? Does that begin to at least speak to some aspect? As you said, it's very big, but hopefully it gives you some way forward at least.
Definitely it does. Thank you very much, Duke. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for the question. Are there others who have questions?
I think we have one more question in the box chat from Lionel. The question is about who initiate to invite you for the restoration process. Like in her experience, the person holding more power is not willing to change.
Yeah. So remember that we talked about that one of the key principles of restorative practices is relationship. And so often it's based on relationships. So, like the example I gave you from Somalia, it wasn't me that got the people to willingness to come, the government officials, the non-government officials, the community to come into the room. It was a local Somali person who had, for a number of years been actively building relationships with these different groups. And so often, like the government, they even said when they came to the first day of the meeting, we don't ever meet with non-government people. That's just not something government people do. And yet they were willing to do it. And it was a large part because of the connections that they had built with, one of the people that I was working with. And so it's always based on relationship. And anyone in restorative practices, anyone can initiate the process. And then sometimes it's part of the work of the facilitator or whoever it is that's gathering people to do a lot of listening. And that's where the nonviolent communication skills come in, is they really help to build our ability to listen, not just at the surface level, but to listen below the surface to kind of what's really the most important thing that that person is speaking about. And so, if whatever, like in this case, if the government workers weren't willing to come initially to a dialogue, the nonviolent communication skills really help us to listen to, well, what are the good reasons? What are the concerns or the worries or what's important to them that's leading them to say no? Because when we listen to that, then sometimes just in the listening, believe it or not, people shift and become willing to, they see why they might. But in the listening, it really helps them to open up to hear some of the other good reasons why they might want to participate, for example, in a dialogue. So the listening, the empathic skills that nonviolent communication helps us to develop when we practice them, it can really help to shift people willingly, not force them, but willingly shift to become willing because they can see how some of their own needs will be met by participating. And that's what happened in the case that, I just shared with you. The government officials had the power that they didn't have to meet. They could just lay down the law. But through the connections, through the relationships, my colleague helped them to see why there could be needs of theirs that would be met by participating. And so they came, even though initially they were still doubtful. Does that answer the person's questions who asked? Great. Great. Thank you for your question. I don't know if we had another question in the chat, or otherwise I see a hand up. I don't know what order they came in. Should I take the hand up, or is there something that came before that we need to address?
Yeah, I think that's a hands up from Julian.
Okay, great.
Hi, Duke, and hi everyone.
Welcome,
So
Juliana.
Duke, do you remember me from India or no?
It was a long time ago. It was a number of years
Yeah,
ago, but yes,
yeah,
it's good to see you.
yeah. Yes, good to see you too. So, Duke, I was just thinking about something you had shared about restorative dialogues and the work you did in Nepal, and just like you're saying now, they see some of their own needs are going to be met. So that common needs that we all have, that some shared needs that people have, and that's how that connects them. So if you want, I don't know if you have time, and if you want to speak to that, I thought it was really powerful in just a few words.
Sure. Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Juliana. Sure.
Yeah.
For those of you who might be new to nonviolent communication, one of the key skills, one of the key elements of nonviolent communication is to be able to identify human needs. And we look at needs a little bit differently in nonviolent communication. We see them as something that's universal to all human beings. So, what are some of the things if, assuming, and I think this is true, that all human beings want a happy life, then what are the things that all human beings would need to have in their life to have a happy life? Maybe you can put in a few things in the chat. What is something that all human beings would need to have a happy life? Maybe we can invite you to put in, one or two of those things, and we can read off a few of those in the chat, if you're willing. So what would be important for you to have in your life to have a happy life that all other human beings, you're guessing, would also want? Go ahead and throw in the chat. Okay. In English, we have love, safety, and care. Yeah, I want all of those. I'm guessing everyone else. Inner peace. Oh boy, would I ever love that. Any other guesses? And maybe we can have some translated if they were in Vietnamese. You want a happy life. What are some of the elements that make up a happy life? Yeah, understanding, belonging, purpose, love, acceptance, to see and be seen, connection, to matter. Yeah, play. Yes. I need more of that. Yeah. Meaningful contribution. Absolutely. Yeah. So just thinking for yourself as you hear all of these, what we call in nonviolent communication needs, are there any of these things that you're saying, nah, I don't want it. Take that love away from me. God, get it away. No, 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 I don't want it. No, I don't want to be safe. No, I don't want to have play in my life. Of course not. It sounds absurd when we put it that way. We all want those things. Well, what nonviolent communication suggests is that these things are the most like they're the things that help us to have a happy life. So whatever we do as human beings, we do them in an attempt to meet needs of ours. So if we turn that in the opposite direction, so to speak, then we can understand other human beings' actions and our own actions if we identify the needs that we're trying to meet. You know, so right now, you came to this question and answer. What nonviolent communication would say is you came to meet some needs of yours. So, what needs of yours are you trying to meet and hopefully are meeting by being here, by sharing your precious time with me and all of us here? What needs of yours are being met by being here, or that at least you are hoping to be met? If you're willing, go ahead and put them in the chat. Growth, community, great. Need translation for that one. Learning, great. Okay, yeah. Yeah. So commitment, alleviate suffering. Yeah. So contribution and maybe, building common goals, connection, learning, sharing, ease. Great. Yeah. So nonviolent communication suggests that all human actions, even violence, is sort of our attempt to meet needs. And so that we can understand each other's actions by the needs that are underneath. So even when people, are doing violence, I can understand the good reasons why they're doing violence by understanding the needs they are trying to meet. It doesn't mean by doing that I agree with the violence or that I want it to continue. Of course not. No, we need to stop it. But when I can see the human reasons underneath that violence, I have more what we call power with that person. In other words, I have more power to influence them to change behavior, like happened in the example. When the government officials heard the needs of the community, heard the needs of the NGO, the non-government organization workers, they had a shift. They could realize, oh, yeah, I share those needs. Because what we say in nonviolent communication is that all needs are these needs that we've identified, they're universal to human beings. All human beings have the same needs. In any given situation, we may have different needs. Like we're here together. I'm here hopefully meeting a need to contribute. You're here maybe for a need for learning, as some of you said. But I know what it feels like to have a need for learning met or not met. And I'm guessing you have an awareness, understanding of what it's like to have a need for contribution met or not met. So in this way, the universality of human needs, we can understand each other even if we've never had that experience. And so when in restorative practices, when we understand each other, one of the ways we can help each other to understand where the other person is coming from, or the other group is coming from, is by identifying the needs. Because, the government workers had the same needs as the non-government workers, as the same needs as the community. So they could understand each other. And when we come to that human level, then we're much more willing, and it's much easier for us to cooperate together to figure out how to move forward in a way that works for all of us. It's when I think you're against me and you're trying to prevent me from getting my needs met, that's when we have more ongoing conflict. So thank you for your question, Juliana. That's the kind of the heart of the way we create that connection and that understanding. And that's what enables us to then shift. And actually, one other point I want to share is just that the beauty of connecting to the needs. When we as a human being know what we're needing, it becomes much easier to then come up with strategies, ways to meet our needs. And so that's another benefit of connecting to needs that nonviolent communication teaches us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliana, for that question. I appreciated what it opened up.
Thank you, Juliana. And I think the next question, I will invite a question from Queen first in the flows, and then we come back to another question from Prashant. So Queen also have a question about, do we need an independent person to do the restorative process? And can a relevant people can do this process?
Great. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Ideally, restorative practices, the people who facilitate the dialogue, for example, they would ideally come from the community. So like, for example, in the case in Somalia, for example, I and other colleagues are ongoingly doing training and these dialogues that we did, I had Somali colleagues assisting me on the dialogue so that they could build their skills and learn how to do it for themselves. So ideally, the person or people who are facilitating the restorative practice would be people who are coming from the same community, or from the same organization or whatever. But there would need to be some checking in with ourselves if, we're going to facilitate. So if I'm facilitating something in my community, one thing I'd want to check in as a facilitator, normally I would not speak for myself. I would be supporting everyone to hear each other. So I'd really want to make sure that even though this is in my community, am I comfortable not speaking? Or is it really, really important for me to speak or to share what's going on in me in relation to this conflict? The other thing I would have to really check in with myself, and again, NVC gives us wonderful skills to do this, is do I have a bias or am I thinking, oh yeah, this person in this group is right and that group is wrong? Because as a facilitator, I want to support everyone equally to be heard and understood. And so if I have a bias in one direction versus another, then I would want to do some of my own internal work to see if I could release that bias. And nonviolent communication gives us skills like self-empathy when we can listen deeply to ourselves or ask someone else to help us listen deeply to identify our needs. For example, a few years ago, before this most recent version of the conflict arose in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, I did some work in Ukraine between Ukrainians and Russians. Well, I grew up in Canada during the Cold War. So I had a lot of external education about how horrible the Russians are and how they're like this and how they're like that. I had a lot of sort of unconscious but cultural education during the Cold War around what horrible people and they're like this and they're like that. So I had to make sure and do some work internally to make sure that before I facilitated the dialogue, that I could equally support the Russian speakers as well as, equally with the Ukrainian speakers, and that I wasn't consciously or unconsciously sort of supporting or preferring the Ukrainian speakers over the Russian speakers because of my unconscious biases and stories about, Russian people. So there are some things that we do in restorative practices to kind of check in and make sure, can we care for and support everyone in the dialogue equally. But yes, ideally, you know, what we're working towards in Somalia, for example, and in other places I've worked, like Rwanda, in Ukraine, can we, can the local people build the skills and the capacity so they can do this work themselves and in their own things? So that's what we're always moving towards. So I always jokingly say I'm working my way out of a job wherever I go. And that's fun. Thank you. Did that get to the question that was asked?
Yeah. And we have like 15 more minutes for this Q&A, and we have two more questions. One from Prashant and another from a case study, I think, from Lank. So maybe I just want to, because the question from Prashant, I think also quite like big one. I just want to check if you want to open your mic and share a little bit so that we can get more about like what you really want to, yeah, get the answer from him. If you feel comfortable. Yeah, I didn't see Russian reaction. So yeah, his question is about like the system are designed for protecting from crime, and in public at large, the family system are more delicate structures with more expectation on ethics and morals to protect the children's well-being. Legal procedure don't have tool on rehab, reparation, deterrent, restorative steps. Using harsh legal procedure to coerce family members into unethical situation is increasing. There's a need of healthy conflict resolution skill, prioritize children's bond with parents and extended family. Educating in ethic and moral is needed. And the question is how to capture the root causes of suffering. Do you have any,
Yeah, I
response to that?
I think one of the things I'm hearing in that is just like how much you're wanting, you know, Prashant is wanting care for the children and inclusion of the children. And I think that's super important. And I know even myself growing up, and certainly even as a stepfather, I had to keep reminding myself that I want to include the children because I grew up in an environment where, you know, the children were sort of best if they were doing what they were supposed to do and not made a lot of complaints and not made a lot of things. And so it wasn't, there wasn't a lot of space for me as a child to speak. And so I really needed that support. But how do we capture the root causes of suffering? For me, that goes back to the idea of community, of not seeing a conflict as between two people, but recognizing that it has, you know, connections to a much broader group of people, both that it affects them, but also that some of the causes or reasons why these two people are having a conflict, it's not just because of the two people. There's roots that go into the wider group of people, the family or the community or the organization. There's ways that we're relating together with each other that are impacting why the two of us are having a conflict. So again, if my sister and I are having a conflict, it's not just because there's something wrong going on between my sister and I. It's also how does our family, our immediate family, relate with each other? How does even the extended family relate with each other? That also impacts, you know, why my sister and I are having a conflict. So if we're going to truly understand at a deeper level what's the, you know, the causes of suffering, as you said, underneath that, then we need to bring those perspectives into the room and hear them and understand them. So it's really important to do that. I'm reminded of a dialogue I did between herders and farmers in Nigeria, where, the herders' cattle were getting into the farmer's land and eating the farmer's land. Well, when they came together, it wasn't just because, the herders are jerks and they just want their animals to graze anywhere and they don't care, or it wasn't that the farmers were being greedy and taking land. There were many, many factors. Some of them were under their control, some of them were beyond their control, like climate change and the fact that arable land was getting less and less. The fact that, land that was reserved for cattle grazing was being taken over because of population growth. So there were many causes to the suffering that were happening between these two groups of people. And so that's one of the things I love about restorative practices is it helps us to see the bigger picture, the bigger reasons and the systemic reasons, how our systems are created, how we function together, how that's part of causing why we're having a conflict. So I hope that captures some of what you were asking. It's certainly one of the reasons why I really value restorative practices to help me see things I can't see that are beyond my capacity. Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Prashant.
Thank you for the very beautiful reminding us. Really trying to understand the context. Also the way to easier to understand people being.
Yeah.
And we have two more questions. One is in the school context and another for the public press, the application of restorative justice.
Okay.
The first one is from Lang. In schools, there are students who are challenging. The teacher understands the students' need for discipline. The students also understand the teacher need for discipline, but the student continue to be uncooperative and breaks the classroom rule. The teacher is stuck in the situation where the classroom can continue without punishment. I think this is a common example in schools. So can you offer any suggestion for this situation from a restorative perspective?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. Yeah, very challenging and common challenge for, I'm sure, teachers all over the world. Yeah. Let's see, where to begin with this one. Well, one, in nonviolent communication, we want to get to the needs as we talked about. And in nonviolent communication, we would consider discipline a strategy, a way to meet needs, not the need itself. So if we have discipline in a classroom, for example, or a student demonstrates discipline, what needs would be met for the student, for the teacher, for all the other students in the classroom? That's what we want to start asking first. So as a teacher, I might have a need for order. I might have a need for connection. I might have a need for support. My job is to support learning, and if there's chaos in the room, it makes it a lot harder to learn. So, and so on and so forth like this. So I would want to identify what are all those needs that I as a teacher have if I'm the teacher. Okay. But that's only part of the community that's involved here, right? The student who's acting out has needs. The other students in the classroom have needs. And so do the parents who send their children to this classroom for certain needs they're hoping to get met. So in restorative practices, we wouldn't just stop at the teacher's needs, we'd also want to look at the student who is quote unquote acting out, right? And so there's a number of things that can happen here. One is we'd want to see, well, what are the good reasons why the student is acting out? Or said a different way and sort of nonviolent communication speak, what are the needs that the student is trying to meet or is not able to meet, and that leads him to act out or her to act out, you know? So maybe that's choice, freedom, independence, inclusion in what he's learning. Aha. Are any of those needs that you all have when you're learning? Right? You have them too. The teacher has those same needs. Okay. Well, I know certainly in the classrooms, most of the classrooms I participated in as a child, I wasn't included in deciding what was learned. I wasn't even asked. I was supposed to just sit there quietly and take in whatever the teacher told me. And I didn't have any choice. I didn't have any freedom. I didn't have any independence in most of the classrooms. Okay. Yeah. Some kids are willing to just, deaden themselves to do that. Others are not. So how can we create a classroom where there is order, there is connection, there is support for learning, and there is some choice, there is some inclusion on the part of the students, there is some freedom? Can we create a classroom where both are happening? So in restorative practices and in nonviolent communication, we want to listen to all of the needs that are in the room. And then together, can we find ways? Sometimes, so it might mean sometimes the students are sitting quietly and calmly and listening and receiving what the teacher is sharing. Maybe it's but also giving the students more choice. Well, here we're going to have this piece of learning. You want to learn this, or this? You can choose. But how do we get all the students to learn? Because they need to learn all three of those things. Well, hey, students, can you teach the other students what you learned? So they're involved, they're contributing, other needs that are getting met. So looking for creative ways that we can address what are all of the needs on the table. And again, I'm not suggesting this is easy, but this can make a big difference when the child sees that, oh, it's not just shut up and, do what I say. It's you care about me. You care about my needs. So I hope that, at least in a quick way, gives some way forward with that question.
Yeah, I saw that you Queen raised hand. Just want to check your question or like is really relating to this topic. Do you want to add to that? One other?
Yeah,
Yes.
please, if you want to add to it, please.
Yes. I want have one question about the restorative practice. So do we need a concrete harm for restorative practice, or it's just a different conflict, just a conflict so we can do the restorative practice? And I also want to invite a demo, an example for the participant here. They can see, okay, what is and restorative practice look like? Just a short version. How does it sound for you?
So you'd like me to give an example of like more concrete, like what does it look like? How does the process itself look? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, yes. If it's examples, we can do the role plays, for example.
Let's see, we have 15 minutes, 17 minutes left. Okay. Let's see. So, just trying to think of an example. So let's imagine that we all live in an apartment complex together. Okay? And Huyen, you just brought home a new puppy dog. And he's very cute. And he's very playful and very energetic. And he's also a little noisy. He barks a lot. He barks a heck of a lot. And initially your neighbors are like, oh, that's okay. It's cute. He's so wonderful. He's cute. But, a day of barking, another day of barking, another day of barking. And they're starting to get like, okay, he's really cute, but the barking's starting to get too much. I'm really getting upset. And so then, one of your neighbors says something to you out of irritation, I wish you'd keep that damn dog shut. Can't you tape his mouth shut or something? And you maybe say something sharp back to them. So maybe that was Kang, Kang who came out and she lives next door to you and she's like, oh my God, this damn dog, you know, and and then, Trang is like, oh God, now my neighbors are fighting and, I live, just down the hall from them and I'm hearing them yelling at each other and I've got this dog barking. My God, this is crazy, you know? So, thankfully, because you've, done nonviolent communication practice, you've thought about, wow, we're going to have conflict in the future. And so you set up a way to work with conflict and you decided on using a restorative practice. There are many kinds of restorative practice. I use the version that's called restorative circles, which comes out of Brazil. But so in that, any one of the three of you or any other neighbor in this, community who's seen this conflict happening, they could initiate a restorative practice, a restorative dialogue. And so we maybe as a community have set up a place in the lobby of the hotel or the apartment where if there's a conflict, someone writes down their name and puts it in a box. And then one of us in the apartment complex checks that box every day or once a week, whatever we've decided. So maybe Trang has put her name in there. And so someone checks it and someone comes to me if I live there and they say, Duke, you facilitate these processes. Can you start? So the first thing that I would do is I would go and sit down with Trang and I would listen to her. Kuyan got this dog and I thought it was really cute, but it's barking all the time. And then, everyone got upset and then now there's fighting here and fighting there and everyone's now complaining. And I just want this resolved. And so I listen to that and I hear the deeper needs and I say back to her what I'm hearing her say. I listen with empathy. And then I ask her, well, who needs to be a part of this circle, this dialogue to help us work with this conflict? And so, Trang might name several different people. Great. So then I go and I would meet in small groups or maybe separately with the different people that Trang, and I would listen to them. What is their version of what's happening? So I would listen with empathy, a key skill that nonviolent communication teaches, and they may name some other people. I would meet with all of them. Once I've met with everyone who's been named, then I would bring all of them together to talk together. And they would talk in a very specific way. There would be 3 questions that they would each have a chance to answer. Everyone would have a chance to speak to each question. And when, like say, Trang was speaking, for example, I would invite Trang to say, who would you like to listen to you? Sounds like a funny question. But part of the process is that we have a deeper kind of listening than just silently sitting quiet and hearing. And so Trang would maybe invite Kang to listen. So Trang would start speaking, and from time to time, I, as a facilitator, would turn to Kang and say, Kang, what did you hear Trang say? So inviting them to say back, not word for word, everything that Trang said, but what was the most important thing or the main message? And then Trang would have a chance to say, yeah, you got me, or, you didn't really understand me. Here's what I meant. And everyone in the circle would have a chance to do that for each question. And the third question when we get to the third question, by that point, everyone has spoken, everyone has a chance to be understood about what's important to them around this conflict. The third question invites us to action. Okay, now that we understand the whole conflict and what's important to everybody in the room, what are we going to do about it? How can we do what we need to do? And so then everyone would have a chance to say, well, I'd like to do this, or, could you and I do that? Or, so it might look like, I don't know, the the dog getting some special training. Maybe there's other things it can do, a white noise machine for when the dog's around. I don't know, but it would be together we would be looking for solutions based on our mutual understanding, And so hopefully we would come out of that dialogue with an action plan that we've all agreed to. Then we go off and do our actions. And then when all those actions were finished, we come together one more time just to check in with each other. Did our actions help? Are things better now? If they did, we celebrate. And if something's not working, then we try to figure out what is it about it that's not working, and is there something we need to do about it different than what we've already done? So it would be that the main part of the dialogue is just someone speaking and someone saying back what they heard that person say, the most important thing or the deeper meaning. And that's the heart of it. The facilitator does that, and the participants do that with each other. And so the beauty of that process is that even if the participants don't have particular listening skills, they develop them while they do the dialogue, and they come to become better and better at listening and more clear about how to share what's important to them. So I hope that at least captures it a little bit.
Thank you, Duc, for very lively stories, example. A lot of people in the room now, they changed the name, like relating to the dog.
Oh, that's great.
Okay, I saw Tham also raise a hand, and I guess that the question also relating to this. And maybe you can share your question.
Yep. I just have a very quick follow-up question based on the very excellent example that then how do we consider the practice of conversation and restorative justice in the context of we are living in a fast pace. We don't have enough time to talk, to listen. I need to solve the problem immediately. I need to sleep tonight, for example. Like that is the burning question that calling me. Thank you. If you can address this. Thank you.
Sure. Yes, unfortunately, our world seems to be inviting us to go faster and faster and faster and faster, even though computers are supposed to make things more simple and give us more time and space. Yes, yeah, so the challenge of fitting those things in. Well, I want to check with you, Tham, and I'm guessing others. Another thing that not only am I suffering from a lack of time because I'm speeding up, but I'm also feeling increasingly more and more lonely and isolated and, not connected with others. And so I think one of the things that nonviolent communication invites us to recognize is, the cost of allowing ourselves to just keep being sped up and sped up and sped up. In other words, what needs of ours are not met and what needs are met also by being sped up and keeping up with things. And then looking at all of those needs and making more clear choices. That's one part of it. Another thing that nonviolent communication helps us with is kind of to see the consequences of our choices further into the future, And so if there is a conflict and we try to deal with it quickly, just come to a quick solution without any kind of care for the relationships involved, what are the long-term consequences of that? And does it save me time to go quickly? Or do I actually go quickly by going slow? You know, if I spend time to care for the relationships in the long term, will that actually save me more time than getting a quick answer now? And that's one of the things that nonviolent communication helps us to see. And it also gives us skills so that we can understand and hear each other in a more quick and direct way. So certainly, you know, like in the dialogues that I facilitate, at the beginning, most of the time people don't have any sort of specific communication skills other than, you know, what they grew up with, which sometimes is wonderful, sometimes is not. But as they practice listening and saying back to each other, they're in the beginning, it might take them 5 or 6 tries back and forth before they understand each other. Towards the end of the, you know, 2 or 3 days of dialogue, whatever, in these big conflicts that I'm working with, they develop skills where now it might be only takes 2 or maybe 3 times at the most to back and forth before they get what the person's saying. And sometimes it happens in the first try. So that's also the beauty of nonviolent communication is we can get to the heart of the matter. Once we practice the skills, we can do it much quicker to really understand, oh, these are the needs and these are the needs that are important to you. Ah, okay. Where in the past, it might have taken me 5, 6, 7, 8 tries before I got anywhere near that. But not easy to still because there's so much pressure in our world to kind of keep up. And I really want to acknowledge that part of it. Okay. Oh,
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I also see you also raised your hand, and I'm still like consider another question from someone that I don't really know the name about the application of restorative practice in public press. I just maybe I can invite the question from like the friends about the application in public press first, and then I can pass it to you, Nhung. Is this okay? And maybe we will have your question. There's the last one.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So the question we also have here is, are restorative practice applicable in the spheres of public press? Recently, when observing major political changes in the media, I see that the information agency create very toxic discussion spaces and tend to divide people. So I'm very curious whether this method can support press agency to orient the direction of building the public discourse space in a way that connects people together.
yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah, the question taps into some of my own pain around how the press, at least here in the United States and in my home country, Canada, also is functioning or not, as my judgment might say. I think the principles of nonviolent communication and restorative practices could very much apply to the press if they were willing to use them. I think the main idea from my perspective would be how can we share a variety of perspectives so that listeners or readers could come to their own conclusions. You know, because certainly here in the United States, you know, we share a point of view and we look for examples that demonstrate this specific point of view. And what I would love to see the press do is to say, okay, here's one point of view, and here's the beautiful needs underneath that point of view. And here's another, which seems to be a different point of view. And here's the beautiful needs under that point of view. And here's a third, and here's a fourth, and here's a fifth point of view. So that we as readers or we as listeners could see more the whole dynamic of the conflict or the problem that's in front of us, instead of one tiny aspect that, typically a press will pound on. This is what the truth is, and here's the solution for it. If they give a solution. Often it's just, here's the problem and here's all the bad people that are causing that problem. And so instead of it being based on right and wrong, good and bad, based on, can we understand each other? And how, me as a press person, how can I support my readers or my listeners to have a more full picture of the whole dynamic that's happening here and all the things that play into this conflict? So from that place, then I could interview and include in my article or include in my interview, in my live time broadcast, people with different perspectives and trying to really understand them, not demonize them or worship them or whatever we tend to do in the press. That would be so helpful, because then we could see together as a community, as a nation, as a world, what our problems really are from many different perspectives, and then work together instead of working against each other on them. So that, for me, is how restorative practices, the principles behind that, the principles behind nonviolent communication, I think how they could potentially support the press to not, instead of create more discord between people, to bring us together, to help us understand. Yeah. So thank you for the question.
And maybe the last question from you. You want to open your mic?
Hi, thank you, and good evening, everyone. And thank you so much for Dirk for your sharing today. And I don't know that if my questions are valid or not, but we have discussed a lot about the how can deal with the conflict with the people around us, or any conflict that we observe outside ourselves. I have a question that is there any kind of like practice or to do with the conflicts inside ourselves? Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Okay.
Yeah. So I love to hear more about that. Thank you.
Okay. I love the question, Nyunga. Thank you for it. Again, I don't know about you folks, but I definitely have inner voices inside of my head, that some saying you should do this, and some saying no, you shouldn't have done that, and so I can have an internal conflict, as I think what you're speaking about. Is that accurate? Where you have different parts of you saying different things? Okay.
Or like a judgment about ourselves, or like at this stage, I something kind of, but it's not like follows the normals of the society, for example. And I started kind of like having some conflicts inside myself, and sometimes I put pressure on myself as well. So I think that is sometimes a kind of conflict that I should how to say prioritize to dealing with first before I can like helping with the outside conflicts.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm enjoying it. Really resonates me with that wisdom of like needing to work on the internal conflicts before I can work on the external ones. Or that's certainly I've found helpful for me as well. Yeah. So how many of you have ever had the situation that Jung is speaking about, where you have different voices or parts of you saying, how come you did that? You shouldn't have done that. That was really stupid, or whatever. Do other people have that too? Yeah. Yeah. I think, unfortunately, it's a human thing. So not only do we have people outside of us who see things in a different way, we even have parts inside of us that see it in a different way, or have that. And that's one of the beautiful skills that nonviolent communication really supports us in learning, is what we call self-empathy, where we turn our empathic listening to ourselves, And so, for example, when we do something, we say some words to someone, and then later some part of us is saying, how could you say that to that person? That was so mean. You know, what were you thinking? You know, that we can turn our listening to that part of us that's you know, have upset about what we did or what we said, you know. And what that looks like is listening to the needs that were not met by, for this part, by what we said, you know. So, you know, right now I'm having a conflict with my mother, and I haven't spoken to her in some weeks. And there's a part of me that's saying, you know, what's wrong with you? What kind of son are you? How can you possibly not speak to your mother? You know, so I can listen to that part of me and say, okay, what are the needs that that part is speaking for? Well, it's things like care for my mother and respect and consideration and awareness of, you know, all that's going on in her in relation to, you know, the conflict we're having. You know, so these are some of my needs, that part of me's needs that are not being met by the way I'm handling this situation, right? Care and respect and consideration, and awareness of, you know, what's going on in my mother. Those are some of my needs that this part is speaking of. So I want to hear that and check in, you know, with that part of me. Is that it? Yeah, that's some of the things that it's saying, you know, come on, you know, and also an acknowledgement of, you know, all that my mother's given me for, you know, my life, you know, also that there's also that need for acknowledgement and holding that. And I'm not calling. I haven't called in a couple, you know, in some weeks. Okay. Well, what nonviolent communication says is there's also good reason why I'm not calling. There's also important needs of mine that are holding me back, that I'm not trusting would be met if I called. So I also want to look at those needs, you know. So what are some of those needs that I'm worried would not be met if I called, right? And that's, I think, care for the relationship, because there's still some anger in me and I don't want that to come out to my mother. So I need a bit more time to do some work with that anger and transform that anger inside of me. So it's care for me and care for her. So I'm not ready yet to speak. It's also something in me is not trusting that I will speak my truth with my mother, because I have a long history of being nice and not taking care of myself. And so I need to figure out how I can speak my truth, but in a way that also has care and consideration for my mother. And I'm still trying I think part of it is the anger is still there, so I need to work with that first. But the idea being here is, can I listen to the different parts of me that are involved in this conflict with my mother? So the same idea, I want to listen to all the parts because they have important information, important needs that are part of the whole conflict dynamic. Does that give you a sense of how nonviolent communication and restorative practice can work internally? Great. Great. Thanks for the question. That's another place where conflict, at least if you're me, conflict happens regularly. So thank you for that example.
Thank you for your answer, and like I really appreciate that for all the questions that you always like offer some of your example very concrete and supported to connect to the yes the real case. I really appreciate that.